At the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, the Irish print media was dominated by relatively conservative newspapers, which tended to support either unionism or Home Rule. There had been more radical papers supporting the more radical political stance of republicanism, associated obviously with the 1916 Rising, but these had been largely shut down by post 1916 censorship legislation. Readership tended to split down sort of socio-religious lines. So the Irish Times, which had been established in 1859, first as a home rule newspaper, albeit by a Protestant member of Parliament, but which had subsequently become very much a unionist newspaper after it was taken over by the Arnott's family in the 1870s. By the 1920s, the Irish Times was very much the newspaper of the Protestant commercial and professional classes, who had also read imported papers from the UK, like the London Times. Working class Protestants, for their part, tended to focus more on more popular UK titles, Daily Telegraph, for example, Daily Mail. By contrast, papers within the Irish Independent group, which had been established in 1896 and then relaunched in 1906, and which was owned by the Murphy family, and indeed would remain owned by the Murphy family up until the 1970s. Papers within the Independent group, which included the Irish Independent itself, the Sunday Independent, and the Evening Herald, they were popular primarily amongst the emerging Catholic middle class and amongst farmers. There were other newspapers. There was the Freeman's Journal, which had been established in 1763, but its circulation had been on the slide since the 1890s after a turned out poor decision to editorially back Charles Stewart Parnell during his rather messy involvement with the divorce of Captain and Kitty O'Shea. There was also at least one evening paper based in Dublin aimed at the Protestant classes, the Dublin Evening Mail, which provided some competition for the independent newspaper's own Evening Herald. Outside Dublin, there was a range of provincial newspapers, or weekly provincial newspapers, and during the 19th century, the more established Protestant newspapers, the older Protestant newspapers, had either faced competition or entirely replaced by nationalist newspapers, which were addressing a wealthier, better educated Catholic class as it emerged during the 19th century. There are also daily newspapers based in some of the smaller cities. Wexford had two daily newspapers in the 1920s, whilst in Cork you had the Crosby family's Cork Examiner. The Crosbys had owned the Cork Examiner pretty much from its inception in 1841. Indeed, they still do today. And you also had the Evening Echo newspaper, which was the Cork local daily evening newspaper. Of the major newspapers, the Freeman's Journal and the Independent broadly supported the new pro-treaty government, so the Cumann na Gael government, as did the Irish Times. Irish Times was a bit less enthusiastic about this. It was a unionist newspaper, but faced with a choice between William Cosgrave's pro-treaty Cumann na Gael government on one hand and De Valera's anti-treaty irregular force that was to become Fianna Fáil in 1926, it was easier for the Irish Times to support the Cosgrave Cumann na Gael pro-treaty government in that particular context. When the Civil War broke out in 1922, the main daily papers were broadly supportive of the pro-treaty government. But there was a recognition that the Civil War was not just a military struggle, but also an ideological struggle, and the state employed censorship mechanisms in a bid to ensure that newspapers framed that struggle in the kind of correct fashion, i.e. a fashion which suited the government. So edicts came out from state censorship instructing newspapers on how to describe the anti-treaty side. Their armies should not be described as an army or as forces or as troops, because that had a sort of an air of legitimation about them. Instead, the word irregular was preferred. For their part, irregulars took direct action against newspapers which they perceived to be pro-treaty and against them. In particular, the Freeman's Journal was singled out for rough treatment. In March 1922, Republican forces entered the offices of the Freeman's Journal in Dublin and effectively destroyed its printing presses. Newsagents in Sligo and in Mayo were bullied basically into refusing to stock the Freeman's Journal, and mail trains coming west from Dublin and used as a form of distributing newspapers around the country, these were sometimes hijacked. Copies of the Freeman's Journal were taken out and basically destroyed. Ironically, this would later leave the Freeman's Journal open to commercial takeover by forces who were actually associated with the irregular side, specifically Eamon de Valera and the anti-treaty party that would become Fianna Fáil. After the destruction of the Freeman's Journal's presses in 1924, the Irish Independent had picked up many of the journal's readers, and by 1924 the journal was on the verge of collapse. De Valera moved to acquire the newspaper to counter what he saw as the anti-republican bias of the other nationalist or the other national dailies. But before he could proceed, the Murphy family, who owned the Irish Independent, stepped in and acquired the journal for £24,000 in December 1924. And they did this not to sort of thwart De Valera, but rather because they wanted to make sure that nobody was able to acquire the Freeman's Journal and then kind of reinvest in it to bring it up to become a kind of significant competitor with the Murphy family's own Irish Independent. As censorship associated with the Civil War conditions faded in the early 1920s, another form of censorship would emerge. This was driven by pressure from conservative, socially conservative Catholic groups. And these regarded imported newspapers from the UK in particular as dangerous, as either, on the one hand, recruiting agents for the British Army, and then on the other hand, as disseminators of information about family planning, about birth control, about contraception. And under pressure from these groups, in 1926, the state established an official committee which revelled in this glorious name of the Committee on Evil Literature. And that committee recommended the establishment of a permanent print censorship regime in Ireland to control the flow of those kind of titles into Ireland. And so in 1929, a censorship of publications board was established that actually still exists today, although it acts very rarely these days. Irish newspapers notionally welcomed the introduction of print censorship on the grounds they considered it morally necessary, with the possible exception of the Irish Times. But there were also pragmatic grounds for supporting censorship because it so clearly targeted UK publications that constituted competition for the Irish titles. In practice, there was a clear class basis or bias in the application of censorship rules in Ireland. The state tended to be far tougher on titles aimed at working class audiences than middle class ones. So, for example, the New Statesman, very much a middle-class English periodical, which routinely carried ads for birth control, were basically left alone because, as John Horgan puts it in his fantastic history of 20th century Irish media, because the middle class and their better educated readers were assumed to be impervious to such temptations. If De Valera was thwarted in his attempt to acquire the Freeman's Journal, this did not entirely deter him from creating a paper of his own. And in 1931, he founds the Irish Press. Although party presses, that is, newspapers owned by or very strongly associated with political papers, were common in Europe, the Irish Press was almost unique in Ireland in the 20th century. The only other significant example, I guess, being Sinn Féin's An Phoblacht newspaper. Yet, although the newspaper would clearly seek to win support for Fianna Fáil and for De Valera, it also had to be commercial because Fianna Fáil simply weren't in a position to subsidise a loss-making newspaper. Thus, as John Horgan puts it, it had to simultaneously acquire and maintain journalistic and commercial credibility within a structure that would also guarantee its political loyalty. To do this, De Valera chose a board for the Irish Press that combined prominent Irish businessmen and at least one prominent member of the Church of Ireland community within Ireland, to demonstrate that the company was both in sound commercial hands and was also non-sectarian. As for political loyalty, De Valera designated himself as the controlling director with more or less infinite authority over all aspects of the newspaper's operation, including its editorial content. So although the paper would not be controlled by the Fianna Fáil party, thus creating a sort of veneer of political independence, it would be controlled by the man who happened to be the head of Fianna Fáil. This had the advantage for De Valera that the paper would not be controlled or would not be subject to constant interference from the party, but nonetheless was going to be broadly sympathetic towards Fianna Fáil. Notwithstanding this, the paper sought to present itself, not very convincingly, but nonetheless sought to present itself as politically non-partisan, representing a vaguely defined national interest, and it targeted natural or what it perceived to be natural Fianna Fáil voters, that is the urban working class and small farmers. The Cumann na Gael government was initially quite hostile towards the press. It banned press reporters from attending government organised meetings, and it withheld press releases that were routinely handed out to other newspapers. The Murphy family, seeking to stifle competition, ensured that the press was not given access to distribution via the special early morning trains that distributed other newspapers from Dublin outside the rest of the country, and it helped that the chairman of the independent newspapers was Lombard Murphy, and Lombard Murphy also sat simultaneously on the board of the Great Southern Railway. This was at a time when railways were not yet in public ownership, but were all basically privately owned. Despite this, the press thrived under especially the editorial influence of the first editor, Frank Gallagher, who populated the newspaper with highly charged and kind of populist, exciting material, such as, for example, in the early 1930s, a series of articles charging that the Irish police were subjecting political opponents of Cumann na Gael, the party that was in power between 1922 and 1932, to brutal treatment. And this actually ultimately led to Gallagher being charged with seditious libel by the administration. Under Gallagher, the press remained manifestly pro-Fianna Fáil in its editorial stance, not least during the 1932 election campaign, which would see Fianna Fáil brought to power for the first time and remain in power until 1948, so 16 years unbroken. De Valera would immediately use his newfound position as head of the Irish government to cement his control of the press. And to understand this, you have to go back 10 years earlier to the period between 1919 and 1921, a period when Eamon de Valera was touring the United States, trying to convince Irish immigrants to basically fund the unofficial government, I guess, of Ireland, because the War of Independence was still going on at this stage. But Sinn Féin, from 1918 onwards, was already asserting that it was the only real kind of official government of Ireland, even though in practice, obviously, it was still under UK rule. So between 1919 and 1921, Irish immigrants were invited by De Valera to subscribe to bonds that were issued by this notional Republican government of the, equally notional Republic of Ireland. And this was as a way of raising funds for the Sinn Féin party and indirectly, I guess, for the prosecution of the War of Independence. This money was deposited into a US bank, but after the Civil War, again after 1922-23, a dispute broke out between De Valera and Cumann na Gael, the party who were actually in power, the pro-treaty side, as to who owned the money. In 1927, the US Supreme Court decided that neither of them did and ordered that the money be paid back to the original subscribers to the bonds. But in 1930, De Valera wrote to the original bondholders, asking them to transfer their right to be reimbursed to him so that he could establish a national newspaper, and many of them agreed to this. So in 1933, now head of government, De Valera introduced an Act of Parliament, a bill, to repay, which basically would allow the Irish state, the Irish Exchequer, to repay the bondholders with 25% interest. So for every dollar you had subscribed back in 1919-21, you would get back $1.25. 1.5 million punts of Irish taxpayers' money found its way back to the bondholders. But of this, 100,000 found its way back to the Irish press based on transfers that had been signed after 1930. So essentially De Valera is able to use the Irish state to indirectly fund the establishment of the Irish press in the first place. However, to be fair, De Valera also moved to defend and shore up the position of Irish newspapers in general once he was in power. And he did this in the context of a broader Fianna Fáil economic policy of economic self-sufficiency known as protectionism. And the idea here was to try and support basically the development of native industries against imported competition in all fields, not just in newspapers. In 1932 and again 1933, Fianna Fáil imposed tariffs, that is, taxes, on imported newspapers and magazines. And this had a real impact on UK newspaper and periodical sales in Ireland. And by the early 1930s, they accounted for 40% of all newspapers and periodicals sold in Ireland. But between 1932 and 1934, in just 2 years, the value of UK imported newspapers and periodicals fell from 216,000 in 1932 to just 99,000 punts in 1934. And those tariffs would remain in place until 1971, when they were eliminated as part of Ireland's preparations for entry to what was then called the European Economic Community, what we now know as the European Union. As the 1930s developed, the editorial positions of the newspapers became clear, and a good test of this was how the various Irish newspapers treated the Spanish Civil War. So the war that lasted between 1936 and 1939 between, on the one hand, the forces of the Republican government of Spain, the elected government, who came from a broadly left-wing political perspective, and on the other side, the fascist or Falange forces, which were led by an army general, Francisco Franco, who of course won the war in 1939, in part with support from the fascist states of Germany and to a lesser extent Italy. Perhaps surprisingly, many Irish newspapers were, well, some Irish newspapers at least, were pro-fascist. And this needs to be thought about. There's a particular context for this. The Irish Independent was unswervingly loyal to the Catholic Church in Ireland. And the fact that Spanish Republicans were regarded as anti-clerical, and in fairness they were anti-clerical, meant that the Irish Independent actually supported Franco and the fascist forces. By contrast, the strong personal feelings of the Irish Times' editor, the strong personal anti-fascist feelings of the Irish Times editor R.N. Smiley, meant that the paper, the Irish Times, took a much more neutral view. It consistently emphasised the fact that the Republican government, of the left-wing government, was the only politically legitimate government of Spain, because it was the only government that actually been put in power by a general election, by a democratic process. But actually, as a consequence of this tacit support of the Republican side, the Irish Times fell foul of, Catholic conservative opinion in Ireland. Ultimately, the Catholic schools of Ireland, as a bloc, removed all their advertising from the Irish Times, and the effect of that was so calamitous that the Times was forced to moderate its pro-Republican stance to a certain extent. Perhaps most strikingly, the Irish press, notwithstanding the fact that its readership was a largely conservative Catholic readership, also emphasised the political legitimacy of the Republican left-wing government. And John Horgan sees this as resulting from De Valera's influence. He was a head of government himself, and he continued to recognise the Republican government as the only legitimate government under international law. Because if he couldn't support, basically, that was the same law which had put De Valera himself in power in Ireland. So he had to support that in other national contexts. De Valera's other major intervention, I guess, with the Irish media in the 1930s came via the drafting of a new Irish constitution in 1937. Article 40.6.1 of De Valera's constitution guaranteed freedom of expression. It states that the state guarantees liberty for the exercise of the following rights, subject to public order and morality. And the first of these is the right of citizens to freely express their convictions and opinions. However, the Irish constitution qualifies this right with the following language: the education of public opinion being, however, a matter of such grave import to the common good, the state shall endeavour to ensure that the organs of public opinion, such as the radio, the press, the cinema, whilst preserving the rightful liberty of expression, including criticism of government policy, shall not be used to undermine public order or morality, or the authority of the state. The article also banned the publication or utterance of blasphemous, seditious, or indecent matter, which is obviously very satisfying for Catholic and other churches. In opposition, Fine Gael sought to delete this second paragraph on the grounds that it placed the interests of the state ahead of the right to freedom of expression. De Valera essentially refused, arguing that total press freedom was basically an impossibility. And I quote from De Valera in his discussion about this in the Dáil, 1937. I say that the right of the citizens to express freely their convictions and opinions cannot, in fact, be permitted in any state. Are we going to have anarchical principles, for example, generally propagated here? I say no. You should not give the proponents of what is wrong and unnatural the same liberty as will be accorded to the proponents of what is right.